to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Matthew Mayer.
And today we have an interesting topic that Matthew's brought into the studio, and it has to do with historicity. Am I saying that right?
That's one of the terms. You can also say historicism.
Historicism, okay. Historicism, which is, there's an ism for us, that it has to do with sort of a philosophy of the existence of history and what its purpose is. Like can you give an example, Matthew, of...
Like, what is the purpose of all this? Where are we leading to? And it's basically we're studying history, like a historiography being the study of history, but here we're using it to understand where is this all going? What are all these events leading up to?
And you were telling us that there's some people who believe that there is no purpose to history, right?
Yes, that would be the libertarian view. Although there is also the Nietzschean view, which takes history as circular.
Okay. How would that work?
Well, everything just starts over. Although it doesn't really work if you think of point A to point B, because if it's circular, then point B is now behind point A. And the problem with that would be that if we were to say that there will be no past or present or future, because the problem is that the past would still continue to exist because we'll be going back to it, and that means the past would exist now, and then we know present, but that would be impossible because what we did now is not what we're doing. What we did is not now.
Okay. So, and then you said libertarians just don't even feel that history has any impact on anything.
Well, philosophical libertarian. We want people to think we're talking about political libertarian.
Okay.
But philosophical libertarian view would be there is no purpose in history. Everything just goes on as it is. We could just say it's the atheist view, basically.
Could you give some examples of historicism, like in general, the philosophies in general, that would be maybe different, that we could compare and contrast a little bit?
I guess I'll go in historical order, pun intended. Okay, we can start off with Whiggish historiography, or Whiggish historicism, which is the idea that history is going to progress towards more liberty, and it's called Whiggish because it was based on in England, where it was talking about, the Whigs going against the Tories in a more progressive view, where they would have England have the constitutional, the monarchy becomes a constitutional monarchy, where Parliament now has more power, and therefore liberty is expanded, and the progressive view is basically history is progressing towards more liberty.
Okay.
And the only problem with the progressive view is that someone gave a visual example. They were showing, They were showing different examples of technological progress where we're getting more and more advanced. Only problem is he then showed weapons, and it showed the weapons getting also more and more advanced, saying, is there really more liberty to this?
Right. Good point.
And so basically, you say we may be materially progressing, sure, but is this really the purpose of life? Because it seems as if it's also way more destructive, and we're going to pretty much see there is no liberty at all when it comes to seeing... Just because we're getting materially progressive doesn't mean we'll get, well, I guess you could say, wiser.
And actually, it seems like more slavery unto those material items, when you think about it, at least in our Catholic view, those temporal things are the things that enslave us, right? If we're not detached from them.
That would be the case right there. And that would be the materialist view. It will be relating to Marxism, but before I get to that, I want to talk about what I almost forgot about, actually. It was George Hegel, if I'm saying that right. I know there's more to his name, but I'm gonna call him Hegel for now, or Hegel. I'm gonna say Hegel right now. Hegel said that the purpose of history in the context of Prussia, it was all of history is leading up to the glorification of Prussia as the final stage. And so the right Hegelians are all saying that Prussia is the final state of history. This is the purpose of history, is the glorification of Prussia. And so that's the purpose. That's it. That's all we have. and that's what Hegel used to justify his dialectical method right there. But then came the left Hegelians, where they say, "Oh no, Prussia's just the next stage. We're going further than this." And so they would use his philosophy, saying he's philosophically right, but he's wrong on saying Prussia's the end of history. We're going further. Karl Marx used to be a left Hegelian, but he disagreed with his idealist view because he was saying the absolute spirit is whenever we have better ideas, we come two contrasting ideas, come up with a middle view, go further. That would be the fallacy of, I forgot the name of the fallacy, but it's basically the fallacy of the middle view, thinking that's always right. It's not necessarily the case, because you could say the middle view between radical democracy, which is corrupt, a mob rule, and a tyranny would be an oligarchy as the better idea, even though that doesn't really help at all. It's just an abusive use of power. But Marx used the left Hegelian view to go further, to say we're going to use material instead of idea. Instead of idealism, we're going to use materialism, where the proletariat are working on the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat eventually one day develop a class conscience and realize that they're being abused by the bourgeoisie, and so they're going to start the inevitable revolt, and so where they will overthrow the bourgeoisie and then create a proletariat rule, but they'll be from it's called state capitalism, and then later eventually the proletariat rule will eventually lead to a stateless society, and it'll be a communist utopia where there is no government but all the proletarians rule.
And what is that called? What you just described, as far as, is that a philosophy in particular?
It'll be Marxist historicism.
Okay.
And so that'll be the Marxist view of historiography. But then comes, his name is Karl Popper, who used to be a Marxist and thought they would finally start the inevitable revolt. Eventually, he was in a shootout with the police, and it failed, the revolt. And then later, after Nazi Germany was taking over Austria, and then later seeing the abuse of the Soviet Union, he came to realize that Marxism was wrong, and he gave up his Marxist view and theorized the fallacy of falsifiability, saying that every theory regarding something empirical must be testable. And he's saying, Marx saying, if the proletariats don't revolt, that means they didn't have a class conscience to begin with. He was like saying, you have a win-win scenario for Marx. You can't test it. And he says that's pseudoscience at that point. It's not really good history, or a study of history, really.
So where does the great Dominican St. Thomas come in?
It's more really his philosophy. He doesn't actually talk about the philosophy of history, and that's one of the criticisms I've heard about Thomism, saying it needs to talk about history, or the philosophy of history. And so I was thinking about it. I was thinking, okay, so when regarding empirical things, it has to be following Aristotle's four causes. It has to be a material, effective, formal, and final. So I would say regarding history, the empirical would be, I would say is space-time continuum, because that's what the universe is basically, and it would be, I would say, history is more the studying of a specific space and a specific time and what's going on in that space and time. And so there will be space-time being one point. The next point being the effective cause, what caused this. As Dominicans, we're going to say God as divine providence causing this. Then we're going to say what's the formal cause. That's God's idea of how history is going to be. That's one of the things we know there should be. As to what it is, that's where it relates to the final cause. We don't know, because we only understand that there should be a final cause, but that we can only understand what's actually complete, what's there. History is still going on, and we won't actually know until the last days what's the point of all of this. But we can certainly say we have at least revelation from God telling us where's this going. But as I would say, that Thomism would be trying to interpreting this, and avoiding Karl Popper, where he was saying, well, you need to be testable, and if it's something spiritual, you can't test it. Again, this is talking about empirical things, and so the fallacy of falsifiability will regard empirical matters. And though history is empirical, we're looking through the invisible through the visible as a Thomas should, and so we're trying to understand the spiritual point of this. So instead of rather than talking about falsifiability, we gotta talk about, is this at least logical, or at least does not contradict logic at all.
And a lot of what we see spiritually is reflected in creation too, right? So when we do study some things in creation, we can actually see some of the things. And I feel like the history, like biblical history, is definitely a way that has shown me more of what God is outside of time and space, right?
That'll be the case, but that's actually kind of the point of this. I'm trying to explain why should we care about biblical history at all. And so this is the point here. One of the interpretations of history was the great man theory, because they thought, well, we need to have a purpose, so we might as well show the great men of history. And so we would say how these people shaped history. We could talk about, well, when I say great, I don't mean great like morally great. I just mean like they played a significant role, like Napoleon,
Alexander the Great, and so forth, right?
And that'll be the case right there. And so we would say, what have these men done, and how they shaped history? And I go, okay, that's good, but will that help all of mankind? Because not everyone can have those skills. And so we would say, okay, so they have shown how they shaped history. But the problem is that apply to everyone? Because if we want to show purpose for everyone, it's going to have to show, is this made for everyone? But the big point actually is that, in the biggest point of all, the metaphysical point here would be, if it wants to show a point for everyone, it has to actually be, are they the purpose of history? They were here, now they're gone. And I'm pretty sure to have a purpose, it has to be serving as the end of history. But to be someone who gives the purpose, not only has to be the end of history, but he also has to be someone who gave history that in the first place. And I was just thinking, because that's also like I guess you would say a Thomistic view, but it's the telos of something, its finality, and basically God being the effective cause. But we also say God is also the final cause. He is beginning and end. But regarding the Thomas or the Christian view in here, getting specific, it would be, okay, so great man theory, it has to be a man to the point where we show that it gives mankind purpose. And so we would say, all right, so it has to be someone from the beginning and the end, but he also has to be a man. Who in the world was a man who was both Alpha and Omega?
Mm-hmm. That would bring us to Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior.
Yes,
right?
And if we were to interpret history like that, it would show that the Christian view of history, or this view of history here, if Jesus really is Alpha and Omega, then the proper interpretation of history will be what I found out to be called salvation history.
So when you talk about salvation history, obviously, we can go back thousands of years, even before that. But in terms of the whole topic of where St. Thomas, I guess, was criticized for not bringing in history in his philosophy, is there something that can be applied to today, that where we can go back and look at what St. Thomas wrote and thought, and can we apply that to some sort of historical perspective?
Well, that was actually the point of this show. I was actually trying to apply it to the historical perspective, using the four causes of Aristotle, learning from St. Thomas Aquinas from those four causes, and how he would apply it to different cases. Like we have Edward Fraser using the as a Thomas, using the four causes to explain the purpose of society, and we would say, in this case, I would try to apply the four causes as a Thomist to the purpose of history. And the reason I want to bring this up also is because we have a lot of historians who are trying to use historicism to justify Marxism. And that was something I actually experienced whenever I was learning at school. And I would say that it's very dangerous to mention this, because it'll get people the idea that revolution is natural, as if this is something we have to do. It's violent and it's inevitable. But if the Thomistic view of history is true, or I would say the Christian view of history, getting more specific, narrowing down Thomism right there, it would say, if that's then revolution isn't the norm, it's mercy that's the norm. or should be the norm.
Well, that would be revolutionary. That mercy would be the norm. Huh?
Culturally revolutionary. I'd say.
Yes, in a good way.
You're listening to Studio with your Third Order Dominicans here in Lafayette, Louisiana, and we are on 90.5 FM and 99.5 FM and 1230 AM. And we are here on this station every Thursday at 4 p.m. thanks to Stein Lumber, with locations throughout all of Acadiana. And today we're getting into the deep weeds, as they say, into Thomism and the historical perspective, and Matthew, in terms of how other philosophers, have you come across other philosophers in terms of how they address this issue at all, or how can we look at other philosophers in terms of history?
Well, it was mostly historical. I mean, I would say a lot of philosophers are mostly relying on Marxist historiography, but there is also a growing movement in transhumanism, in which case it's almost like Whiggish historiography and almost Marxist, but regarding the materialist view, it's more really the development of man into a superhuman. He's becoming more like a cyborg, more robotic, but he's going to become immortal. He's going to be, I guess you could say, like God. You'll become like God, knowing good and evil. He wants to become like God without God. I guess you would say transhumanism is, in this case, satanic.
And talk about going back to, in history, to Adam and Eve biting the apple and Satan, luring them in. This sounds just like that, right?
And I would say that would be the problem with having is transhumanism. I have read some people who are trying, I can't remember his name. Yuval, I can't pronounce his name. All I know is that he wrote the book, Deus Ex Machina, or I can't remember the name of the book, honestly. Homo Deus. Hey, Homo Deus. That's the name of the book. It's Homo Deus. And so he was explaining how he wanted to show that people can become immortal, they become like godlike. And so he was talking about and I was reading it, and I thought, something about this doesn't make sense. Okay, so we live forever, and we have drugs that give us sensual pleasures like Brave New World, which he did mention in the book. And he was portraying that more as a utopia and a dystopia. Problem is that if you read Brave New World, the problem is more existential, because he's talking about how beauty had been destroyed by pleasure. And here I'm just thinking to myself, okay, so we live forever, and we have the drugs to help us. Problem is that existentially we are really having we reached a point of history, but we're only happy by our own pleasures. If we say one day we don't get those pleasures anymore, we're not going to be, I guess you could say, satisfied. But even if we were to have pleasures forever, we're not going to be satisfied by never knowing, I guess you could say, more abstract truths, like more I would say, I want to know more about what's out there. Okay, so you get the pleasures, you feel good, but you're still not satisfied by never knowing what's more as to what's out there. And I knew there was more of an existential problem, not a material, but more of an existential problem towards transhumanism. And what would it be like if you were to become God without God?
So I found the book is, like you said, Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari, if I'm pronouncing it right.
That'll be it.
Yes. He's a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So, we're not recommending the book. We're just saying that it is the kind of a view on transhumanism in an historical perspective, right?
Well, not really much of a historical, kind of, but it's more really, I read the book, he's using a lot of talks on evolution and history, but it seems as if the point of the book was to justify transhumanism and saying why this is a good thing. If you're thinking, just don't think existentially, because then you're going to realize it's not a good thing.
One maybe antidote is a very large book I have sitting on my shelf. Only Man is Made in the Image of God, as opposed to any sort of. So anyway, we're made in the image of God. This is sort of it was written by Dr. Daniel O'Connor, and he in it is a lot of, well, it's almost like a reference book, but his goal is to, I think, be the antidote to this type of thinking.
That would be, if that's the case, that would be highly recommended. But I mean, I actually had to come up with the philosophy of history because I had to read a lot of, I want to say Marxist, but it goes a lot more than that. It's like also feminism, a lot on mostly, I want to say left thinking, but at the same time I don't. But at the same time, you can also say right thinking when it comes to the Whigs. It's very confusing. I don't want to get like, I don't want to sound political, but at the same time, it does relate with politics when it comes to saying that we're getting more. When we're using Hegelian saying Prussia and glory, or the Whigs saying we're getting liberty with the whole parliament. So a lot of people actually try to tie. Thinking about it now, that just came up in my head. Actually, I'm just realizing now a lot of people have tried using historicism and tie it with politics. I was like, I'm just realizing that right now. It's
An epiphany.
I guess strange. It's almost as if people are using philosophy of history just to push political movements. I'm just thinking, whatever happened to, well, life in general? I'm not saying politics isn't part of life, but rather that's not really the purpose of life. I'm pretty sure we all want to be happy as like why we are like God wants us to be happy, but at the same time we have redefined happiness and we made it more political. And I would say I'm pretty sure politics should be shaped by shaped like good life. What is a good life? And I would say that we need to learn how to study history without trying to push politics into it, but rather let politics play itself out by understanding history and humanity and the happiness of humanity, regardless of politics.
So you had mentioned A Brave New World. This is on my reading list. I'll lighten up the conversation a little bit because I haven't read it yet, and I've been told to read it. You've read it obviously, and what are the views in there? I know you kind of touched on it, but what do you feel like there's a benefit to reading that, and what would it be?
Well, I would say you have to be first older to read it because I would say a little too sexual for it. Don't get older. Don't get teens to read it.
Okay.
But at the same time, I would say it's highly recommended because it would say it's giving up like the idea that it's pleasure. We need to think about pleasure, and you'll find out there's someone. I'm not gonna give any spoilers, but there's someone in the book who you think he's a little too tribalistic, a little too backwards, but then later whenever he starts to he tries to understand beauty and has an idea of what the West should be like. I say the West because that's kind of the point we're at right now. But then later when he comes to civilization, he comes to see this is not at all what he had in mind, and he's saying people have replaced beauty with what feels good, and it's basically disgusting and gross, like really gross. Everyone's a complete moron. That's actually it's not like that's actually part of the story. Everyone is gross and a moron, and he's basically freaking out because beauty has been destroyed, and that's actually what Dostoevsky has mentioned once. He says only beauty will save the world.
Okay. And those are the beauty, truth, and goodness are the things that we want to hold on to, which I feel like what you're saying with some of the political movements are trying to be removed, actually.
That's one of the problems with getting rid of the three transcendentals. That's what they're called. Okay. Mm-hmm. The three transcendentals. And although you would say it's ultimately God because God is the synthesis of all. I say all of the transcendentals. He is beauty, truth, and goodness. And someone would say if you just want to come up with one word as the synthesis, it's called love. Nice. But the problem with Brave New World, and this is something I have been writing down also, is that the big problem with love today is that it has been redefined. And so love no longer means love. People say love is love. Problem is that's what you call a tautology. And it's tautological. You doesn't really explain anything at all. It's just
circles around.
It just circles around like that. The thing is that all I can say is you can tell what they mean is basically what feels good. Problem is that there's a lot of things that make me feel good, but are actually incredibly wrong. And it's like sometimes even having vengeance, having that violent urge of hurting someone can feel good. But we know by common sense that's wrong until we maybe say in a few years later we find out that's now the norm and people get mad at that. It's kind of scary thinking about it, but at the same time the purpose here is that love has been redefined, and when it comes to that and regarding history is that when we have redefined love, we get rid of mercy as the purpose of history and salvation history, and so we have to come up with alternative views because love is now no longer love.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. But it really does go back to what you were saying, God, who is the cause of all of this, right? And he is the beginning and the end, is love, is our purpose. And so he comes into history, right? He enters history at just the right time when everybody wants to know what is this truth, this big concept. He enters history and he shows us how to love and in his way, and he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so, I mean, if it's a lot to grasp, but at the same time, it's really simple. And it seems like what you were doing is showing that our historicism is important to view in a Thomistic way. Is that right?
And that would be really important. And I would say, like, yeah, and that was great. I completely forgot about the whole entering into history, and thank you for bringing that up, actually. God existing eternally. He exists outside of history. We exist in history. And the incarnation is God breaking into history. And so he's basically, I guess you could say if this is his story, pun intended, that he was basically serving at this point, I guess, breaking the fourth wall. Because now he is now in the story. The author of history is now in his own story. And so he has become man and exists, but because he has connection with eternity, he brings us living in history to eternity. And so our purpose here, if Jesus is our purpose of life, we must become like him and follow him as his disciples, and that by him living temporally in the world, we may live eternally with him in heaven. And then later, when history comes to an end, we would be the last things, where all of history finally reaches its fulfillment with Jesus as coming as Omega, as the last judgment, and he would and he would perfect. I want to say perfect heaven on earth because the Catholic Church is heaven on earth, but it's more really to have that fulfillment of heaven in the beatific vision sense, and our spiritual fruits of that beatific vision being present unto earth, that heaven. And I guess you could say the invisible heaven, the one that Dante came up with a word with it in his Divine Comedy. I forgot what it was, but that basically the unification of the invisible and the visible. I mean, it's already unified, but this is more really in its, I guess you could say, the heaven in the sense of going to heaven when we die.
And also participating in the kingdom of God is what we're supposed to be doing, so that we bring about what that would look like here on earth right now. We can participate in that even before our death, which is ideal.
Yes. But I mean, don't want to forget to mention that even though I did say earlier, we don't actually know something until it's fully, we don't understand something unless it's actually complete, brought into us. God can reveal it to us, but at the same time, is it something we can fully grasp? I don't think so. All I know is that we can get an idea of what it would be, and we can get an idea of what's going to happen. As to what it will look like, we're just going to have to wait and see.
And while we wait and see, we need to remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the